Don't be fooled by tenuous truces. Nearly 2 weeks on in Sudan, no clear winner in sight yet. The personal power play between rival generals showing all the signs it could spiral into all-out civil war. There's the big prize, the capital Khartoum, and as you can see from these images, there's also Darfur. Tens of thousands have fled there for neighbouring Chad, also internally displaced as armed factions choose sides, while local rivalries and banditry even flares up. How to stop the spiral? Who to stop it? Once the final foreigners have been evacuated, the international community will ignore at its own risk the plight of a diverse nation of 45 million that's bravely been fighting for a return to civilian rule these last 4 years. How many of the best and brightest will instead now be trying their luck crossing the Mediterranean this summer if that spiral is not stopped? Today in the France 24 debate, how to prevent an all-out civil war. And with us here in the studio, activist Ghaffar Mohamedou Sainin. Thanks for being back with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
From Northampton, Massachusetts, Eric Reeves, Sudan researcher at the Rift Valley Institute. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
We hope to get through to Khartoum. We had hoped to reach Amjad Farid, however. One of the difficulties is electricity right now in the Sudanese capital, and that means it's sometimes difficult to have a connection. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, the hashtag is F24debate. Fresh airstrikes this Thursday in the capital. Some 16,000, according to Cairo, who fled north to neighboring Egypt, and tens of thousands either displaced inside of Darfur or again, fleeing to neighboring Chad. Darfur, always on edge, 2 decades after a brutal civil war first erupted there. Brian Quinn has more.
Just across the border from Sudan, this refugee camp has become a new temporary home. These are just some of the thousands of Sudanese who have come to neighboring Chad after fleeing the violence in their home country.
Armed men came to our compound and asked us to leave. We left in a hurry on a donkey to come here. I got separated from my 7 children, and I can't find them.
As residential areas, particularly in the capital Khartoum and neighboring Omdurman, remain shuttered amid ongoing fighting between the Sudanese army and its rival, the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary, food, water, and electricity have become increasingly scarce. Crowds desperate to escape have gathered at border crossings with Egypt and at the Red Sea city of Port Sudan. But it's Chad that looks likely to take the brunt of the exodus.
The people are really very much in need. They are too close to the border. They need to be relocated. For the moment, we are working with a 20,000 refugees operational figure, but we are planning for up to 100,000 worst case scenario.
As chaos reigns in Sudan, sectarian and ethnic violence appear to be returning to its Darfur region, site of a genocide in 2003 and 2004 that left some 300,000 people dead. Chad's limited resources are already strained from hosting 400,000 Sudanese refugees who fled that earlier conflict.
Before we talk about the capital, Ghaffar Mohamedou Sainin, you're from Darfur. What news do you have from there?
Well, the latest news that we are getting from there, the situation is still going from bad to worse as the violence is escalated in there. So Niala, Al-Fashir, the 2 provincial capital, is slightly calmer, but the situation in the area of West Darfur, namely Jenaina, has been aggravated in the last 2-3 days.
Yeah, we showed those images thanks to social media of airstrikes in Al-Jenaina.
I don't. It is airstrike, or you can say artillery shelling. Just a spree of killing by this the
heavy mortar shelling with
heavy mortar shelling by the militias, looting, burning, entering the citizens' house, robbing in broad daylight. So the situation became very, very dangerous in the area of Al-Jenaina, and this has prompted the Sultan of the Masalid to call the Chadian forces to intervene immediately to save, to protect the citizens in there. So what is happening in Jenin is just another cycle of genocide, the episode.
And you see Chadian forces crossing the border?
I don't think, but because it came out of the desperation, because he was the Sultan, the local leaders, they are helpless, because among these 150 people so far confirmed are dead, you have the medical, the workers, nurses, civil servants. So many people have been killed. So far 150 has been counted, but it's still the many dead body on the street.
A week ago, when you were with us on this very set, it was a personal power play between the head of the junta, al-Burhan, General al-Burhan, and his nominal number two, Hemeti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces. Is it the same case today when you look at Darfur, or are there other players?
I think it is the same case, because what's happening in Khartoum is linked to what is happening in Jenin, because Jenin, the area that mostly populated by the Rapid Support Forces and the Arab nomads who were affiliated this the Rapid Support Forces. So the natural reaction of what is happening in Khartoum, because Jenin, the 15th of April, when
because the concern that week ago was the longer it goes on, the more it becomes an ethnic conflict, a tribal conflict.
Yeah, that's what has been said, and the longer it takes, and it became difficult to manage. And now it's scaling beyond the borders, as we see Jenin, because only you take a few hundred meters from Jenin, you will fall on the other side of the another country, the Chad, and a few miles to the south of Jenin, Republic of Central Africa. So the longer it takes, and the more became a violence. And now what we are seeing now, as a result of now the battle, is not being, decided in Khartoum. Until the battle is decided in Khartoum, we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. But what we are seeing, things are heading toward very, very dangerous, because now this has prompted the inhabitants of like a city of like Al-Fashir and Niala to dig up trench. Imagine the citizen, the people, they have to dig up trench to protect themselves from the artilleries, from this random indiscriminate shelling. So we don't know what is going to happen, but the longer it takes and the more precarious it becomes.
More precarious it becomes. Eric Reeves, a couple of points to pick up on there. First off, at what point do you call it a civil war?
I think we can call it a civil war now, or at least the beginning of a civil war. I think the conflict in Khartoum is sufficiently violent. The sides are sufficiently well decided that what we're seeing in El Junaid, to pick up on what Ghaffar said, is that the same kinds of tensions that we can see between Hemeti and the traditional Arab head of the Sudan Armed Forces is picked up by the ways in which the Masalid, one of the important non-Arab tribes in Darfur, which has faced repeated attacks by the Rapid Support Forces and allied Arab militias. That's the image of what we are seeing in Khartoum. And we haven't yet talked about other places, El Obeid, Eastern Sudan. These are all places where violence has been reported and could easily escalate to a very, very dangerous level.
One final point on Wednesday on the issue of Darfur itself. Wednesday came news of the escape from prison of one of the key linchpins of Omar al-Bashir's campaigns, Ahmed Haroum. He's wanted on war crimes charges by the International Criminal Court. Most notably, he ran the Darfur security desk when he was interior minister. The junta refused to hand him over to the ICC after he was arrested in 2019. What was your reaction, Eric Reeves, when you heard that?
It's a peculiar situation. We don't know exactly how these men were freed from Kobar prison, which is also where former President Omar al-Bashir was imprisoned. But it's not just Ahmed Haroun who was released, but Nafi Ali Nafi, Ali Osman Taha, this strong Islamist former vice president. We're not quite sure where Islamists are going to come down in the conflict. But my guess is that both Hemeti and al-Burhan are seeking political support from the very strong remnants of the Islamist movement.
And then both are vying for it.
I think the situation of Ahmad Haroun, he was not alone. He was Ali, Osman Muhammad Taha, Nafi Ali Nafi, the hardliners. They were allowed to leave Kobar prison 2 days ago in north of Khartoum. And I think it's also important to remember that the importance of Ahmad Haroun as a key player in the repression of that the genocide.
So is it as Eric's saying, both sides courting him to build up their alliances?
Now, the statement that was released by the Rapid Support Forces, they're trying to blame the army intelligence of allowing, of releasing this the hardliners so that they can mobilize the troop for them. But still, there are many doubts on that. And on the other camp, he pretends to fight the Islamists. So I don't see how he will go into Hemeti. He will going to have the common ground with the Ahmad Haroun, who used to have differences with Ahmad Haroun.
So it's a brutal situation, but also a bit of a chess game going on, and we're not quite sure who's who.
Definitely, chess game is going on. We don't know quite sure.
What is for certain is that, and you mentioned it, I want to pick up on the point you mentioned, that 12 days on, it's still a very imprecise science verifying claims on who's with whom, who controls what. Hemeti's rapid support forces, for instance, posting the video we're about to show you, claiming, this was on Tuesday, claiming to have taken the headquarters of the Sudanese Army Reserve Forces. That's in the capital, Khartoum. We don't have confirmation on that. Maybe Eric Reeves does, but it's certainly, to pick up on the point that Ghaffar made earlier, Khartoum remains the prize.
It does. And what I would stress at this moment is what an inveterate liar Hemeti is. Not just a liar, but an extravagant liar. He absolutely cannot be trusted, nor can al-Burhan for that matter. But Hemeti is raised lying to an art form, and nothing he says can be trusted. And one of the problems diplomacy has faced is that both men, both generals are not trustworthy, and yet the international community has found it expedient to put their faith in them and exclude, in effect, the voices of civilians who want a democratic Sudan. The resistance committees, for example, are particularly strong and particularly opposed to both al-Burhan and Hemeti, and yet their voices have not been heard at all in recent negotiations, especially subsequent to the coup of October 2021.
To pick up from where Professor Eric Reef left, Hemeti is not only trustworthy, but he's viewed and considered by the vast majority of the Sudanese is the most dangerous for the stability.
And yet he's been the number two for the last 4 years.
So the number two, what brought him to that position, I think the political parties, the force of freedom and change, to play him, because they are the one who negotiated with him when the revolution pushed Hemeti and Burhan to the point where they have to push away al-Bashir. And this guy is just manipulative, and still what is really saddening for the Sudanese people, the international community, is still recognize him as an equal partner, even though Burhan represents the image of the institution that who massacred many.
And he's got international backers, it seems. Eric Reeves, a week ago, there were those denials of reports that he was getting ammunition from Libyan rebel strongman Khalifa Haftar. He has been the one sending mercenaries to Yemen in the past. Why is Hemeti have such a strong backing?
Well, there are many reasons. One of them is that he fought in Yemen at the behest of Saudi Arabia. Haftar is apparently choosing sides, probably prematurely, and we have satellite evidence, clearly supplying the rapid support forces, as is the Wagner Group of Russia, which has very close ties to Hemeti and to Hemeti's gold holdings, gold exports, which go from Sudan to the United Arab Emirates, another player in the game, and then on to Russia. And in fact, Sudanese gold is now a major factor in funding Putin's war in the Ukraine. But gold has made Hemeti extremely wealthy. In 2017, he captured the Jebel Amir gold mine in North Darfur, and from there he has built an empire. He's arguably, I would say, almost certainly the richest man in Sudan, and he knows how to use that wealth for power.
And yes, certainly he's the most richest man in Sudan, and these resources has been accumulated in the last 4 years of the chaos.
And that brings us to what was said a minute ago by Eric Reeves, which is how do you negotiate in these instances a truce? You have the U.S. Secretary of State who in the past hours says they're working on rolling it over. Of course, the current truce is, as we've described, in tatters in many parts. There are the countries like Britain announcing in the last hour that they're relocating their embassy to Ethiopia. How do you, is there any way to negotiate a ceasefire that can hold?
It is impossible for them at the present moment because of the ceasefire. Is one side is desperately fighting to survive. Gamble on it, Hemeti. He thought it's going to be easy of getting rid of al-Burhan.
But it's not just one side. I mean, we're hearing the sound of airstrikes in the capital, and we can presume that those are government
the other side.
The
other side, what it started has to finish. Otherwise, we're going to put the Burhan in a very predictive situation. So the ceasefire, the truce, it is impossible. The truce has been violated. The first truce has been violated from the first day. The second, we are on the third truce, which has already failed from the beginning. So it is impossible for the meantime.
Eric Reeves, you agree?
All evidence would suggest that this is a fight to the death, that al-Burhan, having engaged with Hemeti, is not going to let Hemeti reconstitute himself. One reason the truces have failed is that they would give Hemeti and his rapid support forces an opportunity to resupply, to receive some of what Haftar in Libya has sent. The Sudan Armed Forces has performed very poorly. They have very few troops on the street ferreting out rapid support forces from the areas where they have really burrowed into communities and neighborhoods. They're content to use air power and artillery and mortar fire. But that's not going to win this war. And the longer it goes on, the more desperate both men are for some sort of victory. But if no victory is achievable, we have to begin to wonder about whether Sudan can survive as a state. Already there's really a tremendous disconnect between Khartoum and the peripheral areas, including Darfur, but also South Kordofan, the eastern states. it's a highly chaotic situation, becoming more chaotic, more destructive. And really, the question we should be asking ourselves is, how do we respond to what is a looming, vast humanitarian catastrophe? How do we give food to people in a country that is very poor, has a tremendous malnutrition rate, especially among children?
And coming back to the issue of truce and a ceasefire, I think for the first time, the Sudanese, because what we are reading from the people in the street, so there is sentiment of a national mobilization to support, regardless of the army's chief position, to just get this war done as soon as possible. So if Burhan, the risk will be if Burhan let Hemeti to escape from this his predicament, I think Burhan will be facing trouble. So this is why I don't see any prospect of the peace coming from from the army position.
At this point in time, food running low in the capital. And also a new concern that's been flagged, and you just heard Eric Reeves describe Sudan as a state starting to flag. There's the World Health Organization, which is sounding the alarm. We've had days of no electricity in Khartoum, stranded personnel. That might mean that pharmacies running low, residents of the capital wondering just how long they can endure urban warfare.
In more than 4 or 5 days, there will be no supplies left. We're trying to provide fruit and vegetables and keep up the supply, but we've run out of grains, canned food, flour and sugar.
I have chronic diseases, diabetes and hypertension. Since the beginning of the fighting, I haven't found an open pharmacy.
Well, at this point, we can cross to Port Sudan and say hello to Kholoud Hayer, founding director of Confluence Advisory. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Last time we spoke with you, you were in the capital. Tell us how you got to where you are now.
Well, it was quite an arduous journey, something that takes usually 10 to 12 hours. Took upwards of 30 hours to reach Port Sudan. And that's because there were many checkpoints on the road, but also because we traveled in quite a large convoy, so had to have frequent stops. What's interesting about the trip towards Port Sudan is that we saw a lot more paramilitary forces around the Khartoum area, and then further along in the east saw much more of a presence of the armed forces. But that just means that the clashes are more likely to migrate out of Khartoum eastwards as well, which means that the only safe route that exists now, with the difficulties of getting into Egypt to the north, Ethiopia to the south, may soon be compromised.
So the fighting is spreading out. For now, where you are in Port Sudan, though, it's safe.
It is quite safe. The only issue is that we're already seeing signs of the war economy spreading to Port Sudan. So we've seen facilitation fees for getting on the Saudi-sponsored boats, which are free, range from around $100 to $600. We've seen petrol being scarce and prices shooting up. Even centralized banking systems, which are down, banks which have been closed, have impacted the level of liquidity that people have, therefore causing a rise in inflation. The number of people coming in from Khartoum is increasing, which is going to put pressure on the already limited public services in Red Sea, as well as provisions of food and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, by land, by sea, as you mentioned, Kholoud, they're evacuating. In Port Sudan, we've seen French ships, we've seen Chinese ships, which have so far evacuated more than 1,300 of their citizens before ferrying them across the Red Sea to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, China, which is Sudan's largest trading partner. Kholoud Hayer, your thoughts on the focus of the international community being on these evacuations?
I think it's unsurprising, frankly, but it is still quite disappointing. what we know from the ways in which Bashir and his legacy in Burhan and Hemeti and the playbook that was forged by Bashir, we know that as soon as international eyes and ears can no longer bear witness to the regime's abuses, those abuses tend to skyrocket. So firstly, the absence of international observers on the ground is going to impact the humanitarian situation and the human rights situation. But beyond that, all of the air, all of the oxygen in capitals right now is focused on evacuation, with very little attention being placed on what kind of efforts can be put towards ending the conflict and meeting humanitarian needs. For example, all of these flights and ships that come in to take foreigners away, why aren't they laden with aid for the people of Sudan to ensure that they are also able to access, as one of your interviewees just said, insulin, hypertension medicine, things that are in very short supply?
And there's even at this point in time been a little bit of skirmishing between Western chancelleries. We saw the Germans criticize Britain when last Saturday they evacuated their embassy staff first. Germany's defense minister was asked Monday why Britain had already managed to get that embassy staff out. He seemed to suggest a bit of a cavalier attitude on the part of London.
Britain was there so early because, how can I phrase this diplomatically, they overrode what the Sudanese had stipulated.
And by the way, on the heels of that, now comes German irritation over Britain's Tuesday landing of its first plane to evacuate from a military base outside Khartoum without first negotiating with the Sudanese military. The BBC quoting one source that claims that having landed without permission, the British had to pay the army before leaving, and negotiations to use the airfield meant that German rescuers lost half a day. What was your reaction to this spat between Germany and Britain?
Well, I don't know. I can't say what the reaction between these great forces. Each one of the forces, they are focusing on evacuating their citizen, while we are left to just suffer in these circumstances. And there are many desperate. The Sudanese are left behind to struggle because there are many people who wanted to leave immediately, but they can't leave it because of their passport either are being, the embassies, they just shut the embassy and just run away. And there are many as well, many hundreds of thousands are stuck on the borders where the situation is very chaotic and became critical on the border of Egypt, where the other foreigners, the EUs, the Europeans, the Gulf states were allowed to in, but the Sudanese have to queue up for entry visa while they are fleeing from war. So it is quite hypocritical, to see this, the Western and the international community who used to, came for this to be part of this Sudan's problem, who were just left to suffer. And I'm not surprised this the contradiction why these people. The Germans are criticizing the British.
Kholoud Haïr, you have the floor. Tell our viewers who are in France, in Britain, in the United States and other parts, why what's happening to ordinary Sudanese matters.
Well, because they're the people that have been left behind. And in many ways, the ways in which this conflict has come about is in large part due to the way in which the political process has unfolded. And that political process was led by the international community, by the very same countries now rushing to get their people out. And so the international community has a responsibility towards the Sudanese people, whom they forced into a political process that has had devastating consequences, even before this conflict broke out, and have now effectively been left to fend for themselves.
But it wasn't the international, forgive me for interrupting, Kholoud, it wasn't the international community that in 2019 said that there's going to be power sharing between the military and the civilians trying to make that transition after Omar al-Bashir's rule to civilian rule. That was something that was decided by the Sudanese themselves.
The initial power sharing in 2019 was decided through several different chains. Part of that was pressure from the international community because they didn't see a pathway towards stability that did not include the general. Since 2019, where there was a massacre committed by the same generals currently fighting, the international community has never pursued any accountability for that, and it has forced the civilians to accept rhetorical politics and gestural politics rather than real commitment to democracy. Everyone in Sudan knew these were not the generals to shepherd in civilian democratic rule. Everyone knew that these generals could come to blows and settle scores in the most disastrous way. And yet we were told the only way was to handhold these generals and gently, frame them as reformers rather than the sort of single-minded, ambitious generals we know them to be.
Eric Reeves, is that your reading of how we got to this point?
I think that's an admirable summary of how we got to this point. And I would come back, though, to what strikes me as the most important issue here, with so much focus on evacuations and what's going on at Port Sudan or what's happening in Egypt. Sudan is a country of 45 million people. Virtually all those people are going to be in Sudan when the humanitarian crisis peaks. And that's going to be food, medicine, and indeed, the idea that ships would come to Port Sudan laden with nothing, with no food, no medicine, is obscene. We are going to see in the very near future catastrophic loss of life, catastrophic suffering. And it will be especially true in the peripheries, not just Khartoum, although Khartoum now is suffering, especially at the hands of the rapid support forces, which are behaving with extreme brutality in many, many neighborhoods where they've hunkered down. But let's keep our eye on the largest problem here, which is how a country that is in the midst of a quasi-civil war, at least, will feed itself, will provide medicine, will provide any of the essential services that are necessary.
So let me ask you, Eric, to play a U.S. correspondent here for a second. What is the calculus inside of the State Department? How does the United States see all of this?
I'm afraid I have to say that the United States has, for many years now, viewed Sudan through either the lens of how can we get them to cooperate on counterterrorism, or to try and make deals with the men who have guns. And the idea of reaching a peace and a democratic transition with generals who are untrustworthy, who have extremely violent pasts. Hemeti was the one who continued the genocide in Darfur from 2013 to the present. I think back to a statement by Princeton Lyman, who was a former special envoy for the Sudans, who declared in an interview that we don't want to see regime change. This was when al-Bashir was in power. We don't want to see regime change. We want to see this regime preside over democratic transformation of Sudan. I really can't think of a more disingenuous and preposterous assertion about what could be expected of al-Bashir. But this was the expedient way, and that expediency has been the driver, I'm afraid, of U.S. policy for a very long time.
Coming back to the point of the humanitarian catastrophe that now we are facing, I think, like Eric rightly pointed, in the coming days, the situation even will be more aggravated for the region of Darfur, especially because of the already there is shortage of food, medicines, the first necessities. So with this escalation, I think the most victim is going to be Darfur. Is going to be suffering because of the shortage of supply, because the country at the moment stands still. So the coming days, the things are going to be very difficult, tough.
And how do you get supplies to Darfur while there's still fighting going on? What do you do?
Because it's the only solution to just flee the cities, the villages, the town toward the nearest the point, Chad, which is already suffering so much because of the Darfur crisis in the last 20 years or so. So this limbo, and people, they don't have a choice but to flee. The nearest, the point is the Chad. So this is why the international community, I think, is urgently must take the necessary action to focus on more humanitarian the situation than focusing on how and when the war is going to be ended in Khartoum, because the game in Khartoum is unseen for the meantime.
Kholoud Hayer, whose job is it to figure out how to feed Sudan in the midst of urban warfare? Kholoud Hayer, yes, can you hear us? Kholoud, can you hear us? All right, we'll try to reconnect with Kholoud Hayer in Port Sudan. What about the role of France in all of this?
Role of France.
Chad is a former French colony.
The longest border of Sudan have the Francophonian country, which is 1,300 kilometers. France should be worried more than any other country, because the problem will be spill over to Chad, to other places, unless some concrete step has been taken by the French.
And there are insurgencies in Chad as well.
Insurgencies in Chad.
One of the questions put to us, and I'll put it to you, Eric Reeves, on the hashtag F24 debate, it's by Salah. He says, does it feel like all the Ethiopian Tigrayan militiamen are just heading north to Sudan to find militiaman jobs? I don't know if that's true or not, but there is this feeling with 5 of the 7 countries that surround Sudan have armed conflict in one form or another. Does that mean that there are mercenaries for hire?
Oh, yes. And indeed, Hemeti has made a tremendous amount of money by hiring out his rapid support forces. It's one of the reasons they've grown to perhaps 100,000 at this point, larger than the regular Sudan armed forces. But Chad, it seems to me, is at least one avenue by which Darfur can be reached. The UN High Commission for Refugees did a decent job initially in 2003, 2004, but has since really abandoned almost 400,000 people, and that number is going to grow dramatically. The UN and France and other countries should put pressure on President Deby to allow humanitarian convoys through N'Djamena and to the border, and perhaps even cross-border transportation of critical supplies. Cross-border humanitarian aid has not been permitted, but these are desperate circumstances, and I think France should do everything it can. The UN should do everything it can. Countries with leverage over Chad should do what they can to ensure that there are humanitarian corridors. Securing humanitarian corridors inside Sudan would be much, much more difficult, but we're going to have to get food from Port Sudan to Darfur one way or another, and to the other regions of the east and the south that suffer as a consequence of the disintegration of the Sudanese economy, along with the state itself.
I think international community and UN and these they must think of also putting the forces of the civilian protection as well. So I think the coming period, we don't know what is going to.
What are you suggesting, that there should be blue helmets, that there should be peacekeepers?
Definitely. Places like the massacre right now that is taking place in places like Niala, the Jenaina. Tomorrow would befall in Niala. After tomorrow would befall in Al-Fashir. And the South Sudan armed forces were unable to protect the civilian for the meantime, because all of them, they are trenched in their military installation to defend themselves from the attack. So this spree killing will lead to the catastrophe and out-all war, potential out-all war that is going to be deadly. Therefore, I think there is amounts of, the weapon that been transport from the places like Libya and other places. So I think as a Darfurian, as a Sudanese, I'm more concerned, very concerned in the coming days. The thing will be, so international community and the great powers like France, and they should think of option of, pushing for the blue helmet, at least from the neighboring country of like a Chad,
Eric Reeves, is that realistic?
It's not realistic, I'm afraid. I hate to disagree with my good friend and colleague, but after the failure of the UN African Union mission in Darfur, and it failed catastrophically, and it was extremely difficult to get UN Security Council authorization, and no UN peacekeeping operation can be mounted without Security Council authority. So I wholly agree with the desirability of blue helmets protecting convoys from Port Sudan to western and southern areas, but it's just not going to happen. The failure of UNAMID, the threat of a Chinese or Russian veto on the Security Council, means that we're going to have to look at other forms of providing security. And we know that the Wagner Group is going to do all he can to obstruct aid to Darfur and aid to Khartoum.
And is that the way that the international community's attention gets piqued by talk of the Russians, what with our focus here in Europe being on Ukraine and the standoff with Russia there?
Well, Russia, I've seen a number of comments saying, leave Russia out of this, leave Russia out of it. But the Wagner Group is a key ally of Hemeti. The Wagner Group has provided weapons, training, including urban warfare training. They are central in this conflict. They are not peripheral actors. They're in Sudan. They are ruthless. They're well-trained. And the fighting is going to be exacerbated by the presence of the Wagner Group, and ensures that Russia would never agree to any sort of UN peacekeeping force. We have an almost insoluble problem, but we need at least to foreground the need for humanitarian aid in the most urgent terms.
Very briefly, because we're out of time, Ghaffar Mohamedou Fasainin, your family, what's their plan? Stay put? Move?
They cannot stay because they will die from shortage of basic necessities.
This is because you have family in the capital as well as in Darfur.
Yeah, in Darfur as well, in capital and other places in the coming days. So everyone is thinking of just, fleeing.
But fleeing where?
To some safer places like a Chad, because toward Egypt it's not that easy. Toward other countries, it's unknown destiny. So the most likely destination for the Darfurian families of those who are already displaced from their original villages to the IDP camps, they have to just think of getting out of what is coming in the coming days, because we are expecting wars.
Our thoughts go out to your family. Ghaffar Mohamedou Fasainin, thank you for being with us. I want to thank Eric Reeves. Apologies to Halul Hayer. It's difficult getting electricity these days with parts in Sudan. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.